Benvenuti, sono Juan Carlos De Martin, sono docente del corso dell'insegnamento all'interno del quale c'è questo incontro pubblico, un corso interdisciplinare su temi in realtà molto vicini all'argomento della lezione che terrà il nostro ospite. Io dico soltanto due parole per dire come sarà strutturato l'incontro. L'incontro appena finisco di parlare darò la parola al microfono al professor Roberto Lalli, storico della scienza e della tecnologia qui al Politecnico di Torino, che tra l'altro ringrazio anche per essere stato il punto di contatto col professor Edwards, che ha accettato siamo molto grati di aver accettato il nostro invito. Dopodiché ci sarà una lezione del professor Edwards, abbiamo detto di prendersi tutto il tempo che vuole, credo che orientativamente parlerà circa un'ora, e poi dopo inizierà una discussione con i presenti, a partire dalla professoressa Isabella Consolati, che ringrazio anche lei, storica del pensiero politico, che farà la prima discussion, potremmo dire, ma dopodiché vedo anche molti colleghi, sono tutti quanti invitati, la professoressa Trico, la professoressa Meo, i miei studenti, tutti quanti presenti, a intervenire per reagire alla lezione del professor Edwards, fare domande, approfittare della sua presenza qui. Detto questo, vi ringrazio di essere presenti, ringrazio anche chi è collegato da remoto, perché la lezione è in streaming, quindi tenetelo presente anche se intervenite, che sarà collegato in streaming, ed è anche registrata perché verrà poi messa la registrazione sul sito del centro Nexa su Internet e Società. Quindi grazie ancora, la parola a Roberto.
Grazie Juan Carlos. Now we switch to English. So thank you everybody, thank you Professor Ados for having accepted the invitation by Professor De Martin. It's a great pleasure and also emotionally important for me to present Professor Paul Ados, who has been very important for my own field of study, for other fields of studies into which my own research is very much related. In fact, Professor Poledos is one of the leading historians of technology and scholars of science and technology studies in the last 30 years and more. Across his career, he has explored how technologies are never merely purely technical objects. They are also political instruments, cultural symbols, infrastructures of knowledge, and importantly, ways of imagining the world. So until his recent retirement in January 2026, if I understood correctly from his official page in Stanford, for escaping the rising fascism in the USA, so welcome here in Europe, and hopefully you will not be disappointed by the rising fascism here. Paul was director of the program of Science, Technology and Society at Stanford University, and a senior research scholar at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. He has also co-directed the Stanford Existential Risks Initiative with Professor Steve Lavin. He has been professor of information and history, and now is emeritus professor of information history at the University of Michigan, where he has worked for 19 years, and in the School of Information in the Department of History and STS program. Early in his career, he has also taught at Stanford in both STS program and computer science department. So as you can see, Paul's research and activity has never belonged to only one field. His scholarship moves across various disciplines: the history of technology, information studies, Cold War history, climate science, international security, infrastructure studies, and the politics of expertise, to mention a few. He got his PhD in interdisciplinary graduate program, History of Consciousness, at the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1988, under the supervision of Donna Haraway, a prominent American scholar in the field of science and technology studies. His first major book is based on his dissertation. It's named The Closed World, Computers and the Politics of Discourse in Cold War America. Has been published with the MIT Press in 1918, the year of his dissertation. Congratulations for the speedy publication. Quite a few years later, 1996. So that's the standard American time for publication. We will talk about the book later, but just to briefly introduce, he showed how computers became central to Cold War systems of command, control, simulation, and political imagination. including the emergence of fields related to computing, such as artificial intelligence. His second major book, a monograph, A Vast Machine, Computer Models, Climate Data and Politics of Global Warming, was published in 2010 with MIT Press and examines how computers, global data and models construct our modern understanding of climate change. There's been also a very important book. We also got a prestigious prize, the Computer History Museum Book Prize from the Society for the was shot from the Society for the History of Technology. He has received many honors during his careers, including a fellowship at Guggenheim Fellowship, a Carnegie Scholarship, an election as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and just last year, a highly prestigious prize, the John Desmond Bernard Prize from the Society for Social Studies of Science. So his activities go also well beyond the academic environment. Among other things, he served as one of the lead authors of the Working Group 1 with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment. So thanks a lot for all your work you've been doing so far, which shaped generation of scholars in various fields, certainly the history of technology and in social studies of science and technologies. And I will mention just one last thing, that Professor Edwards' work is especially powerful in his ability to connect very different scales that are often treated separately, machines and metaphors, laboratories and states, infrastructure and global politics, technical systems and cultural imagination. You will see all of that in his presentation today about the global world. Thank you very much again, and join me in welcoming Professor Paul Edwards.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Juan Carlos, for those very kind introductions. And thanks to all of you for being here. I offered this talk to Juan Carlos and Roberto because I've been invited to revisit this book for a special issue of a journal about artificial intelligence and war. I checked out of that field after I finished this book in 1996 and focused on climate science for really the last 30 years. But I mean, nobody can avoid thinking about AI today. And so I have been doing that too, and now I'm kind of diving back in. So this is the first time I've given a talk like this, and I'm going to be working out ideas while I talk, and I'm going to ask you to help me with that. And let me just begin by showing you a few images. Oh, I can't do that with this thing. It's weird. So I'm going to leave these on the screen for 10 or seconds, and there are 3 of them, and then I'll show you a slide that has all of them. And I want you to think about what they say to you. What do you think they are? These are all from the period around in the second half of the 1950s. Okay, anybody, what do you see in these images? And please, if you feel like your English is shaky, don't worry about it. I live in France, my French is pretty shaky, so that's fine. Just speak up. So let's talk about this one first. What's happening here? What do you see there? We're looking at the Earth from the North Pole. So you're seeing the Eurasia on the top and North America on the bottom.
Attacks from the Soviet Union to the United States.
Attacks from the Soviet Union. Okay. What do others see? Anything about the colors? What's in the picture? If it's an attack from the Soviet Union, what is the threat? What's in the sky?
Nuclear weapons.
Sorry?
Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons, okay. others. What about the colors here? What about this one at the top, and especially this and this?
A lot of red.
A lot of red. What does red mean in 1955? Communism, sure. And what about this image on the top left there? What is that?
Like a defensive shield?
It's like there's kind of a fence or a chain or something around the 48 states of the United States. Okay, I won't keep you in suspense anymore. We don't have a clicker here, do we, to advance the slides? Okay, it's all right. I'm gonna do it out. So this book came out in 1996. Was written, as Roberto said, it began as a dissertation. I graduated in 1988. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. That was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, which really went on until 1992. So it's called The Closed World, Computers and the Politics of Discourse in Cold War America. Now that word discourse at the time for me came from Michel Foucault, and it was intended to mean not just talking about things, not just language about the world, but a whole constellation of language, technology, built environments, metaphors, political ideas, and imagined futures. And so in a lot of ways, the book is a history of computers, but it's only about the relationship between the military services in America during the Cold War and those computers. Okay, great. Thank you. So I think maybe a better way to say that word, a better word for that now might be something like technopolitical imaginary. So how did people think about the technology they were building in the context of the politics of the time and the future that they wanted and the future that they feared? So the central policy of the Cold War from the United States point of view, and I want to stress that when I talk about the Cold War today, I'm only talking about it from the United States perspective. A lot happened during that very long period. A lot of it was not about the United States, but I'm just focusing on my own country. So the essential policy was containment. So we were at a point in history, right after World War II, where Europe was weakened, Japan was weakened, the Soviet Union was expanding into Eastern Europe, Germany was divided, Soviet Union was making moves into Africa and Asia, the Chinese Revolution, Communist Revolution in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb in 1949, Korea, the Chinese communists supported a rebellion by communists in the northern part of Korea, and that war began in 1950 and lasted 2 years, ended in a divided Korean peninsula. And the kind of promise of permanent protection from the United States. And, of course, more than anything else, there was the nuclear arms race developing. So the policy of the United States was to try to contain the expansion of communism. That was containment. And the idea was, the USSR was a very secretive society. It was, so it was a closed universe of its own. And then the US would contain it in, some of that symbolism that you saw in the images was about keeping it confined. But of course, the world as a whole was a closed world for the United States that had to be defended. And we'll get back to that in a minute. So, I mean, I grew up during this period of time. I was born in 1957, the year that the first satellite was launched. That's the thing you saw on that slide. With the airplanes delivering nuclear weapons, missiles delivering nuclear weapons, and satellites flying around the planet. And at that time, we didn't really know what they were going to do, but you know now. And so the ideology of that entire period, and I mean, I remember this was visceral at the time, was that communism was evil. The United States was a representative of freedom. It was a very black and white conflict, light and darkness, good and evil. And then for a while, and this came back repeatedly, there was the idea of an enemy within. And this also happened in Europe around communism, that the invader could also be a communist party or communist terrorists in your own country. So, to me, this slide, which came from a North Atlantic Air Defense Command slide deck in 1958, just kind of captures how people thought about the United States. We have to protect it. We have to build a defensive shield around it, but we also have to contain the Soviet Union within its own space. Boy, I don't know why it's doing that. So.
No.
Stop. So, during World War II, there was a lot of work on the earliest things that we would today call computers. A lot of it happened in the US, a lot more in the UK and in Germany. But after World War II, there was a huge push by the United States military to build these new machines. And one of the features of this book is to discuss why they wanted that. So during the war, most of the research was directed at calculating ballistics trajectories for artillery, at research for the nuclear weapons project, and breaking of codes. After the war, these machines became successful, and with very, very minimal capabilities from today's point of view, they were applied to weather prediction and weather control and to air defense. So air defense means defending against bombers and then eventually against missiles sent from the Soviet Union into the United States. That's a long, long way. Gosh, I don't know. This was happening to me when I was making this deck. I don't know what's going on here, but we will see that happen again. So, 1951, during the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur, one of the most famous military commanders in the United States, is in Congress in a hearing, and he says, you can't let one half of the world slide into slavery and confine yourself to defending the other. We defend every place. And I say we have the capacity to do it. And it's that last piece, having the capacity to do it, that for me is the most interesting thing about the way this project developed as a techno-political design. So I sometimes put it like this as sort of an equation. You have this policy of containment. You have enormous distances for bombers to travel. That was the first delivery vehicle before missiles. And then you have missiles that travel that distance in half an hour. So the time pressure becomes very, very great. You also have in the United States what could be called anti-militarism, and I mean something very specific by that. The history of the United States is that after wars, the number of, up until this point, the numbers of men under arms was drawn way down. So at the beginning of the Spanish-American War in the late 19th century, there were only 25,000 people in the US Army. And they had to call up 125,000 more to fight that war. It was a much lower population, much earlier time period. But the same thing happened after World War I, demilitarize, we keep a military force, but it's not a major feature of the society. It's not a vehicle for people to have careers and kind of move upward in that world. And then you have nuclear weapons, and we all know what that means. And so the summary of all that is that the strategy that has to be adopted, as they thought of it at the time, is more technology for speed, for heavier weapons, more weapons, and to do this competition with a whole society on the other side of the planet. So here we are seeing that again. There are also submarines in this picture, down here, and missiles. And in the book, there's a chapter about this first air defense system developed to protect the United States. And the idea is, it's a gigantic place. How do you sense incoming aircraft from over the pole across the entire northern border, or maybe they're going to come from somewhere else, from the east or the west or from the south? How do you monitor all that? And remember, no internet, telephones are still kind of getting going. There is not the sort of communication technology that we have now. None of the sensors that we have now. Most sensors are not digital, so they do not provide numbers. They only provide measurements, and so on. So the concept of this thing, the semi-automatic ground environment, was that you would have several, actually 25 central bases with huge computers, and each computer could monitor a particular area all around it, and also control weapons that could counterattack if we were being attacked. So what you see here is the idea that the shortest distance is over the pole, and that's likely where the Soviet bombers would come in. And here too, I know it's hard to see, but this is North America, Russia is up there, and these are a series of radar lines that were constructed in the northern United States and across Canada to detect these incoming aircraft. So then the signals from those radars are sent to these huge computer bases known as direction centers. And you can kind of get the idea from this. You have a bunch of things that are picking up signals. So there's an early warning airplane. These are more radar domes, more radars down here. There are weapons here. And then there are interceptors that would attack the incoming bombers. And all of it would be controlled with a computer. And this isn't, again, we're talking about a thing that would be barely big enough to power your digital watch. They did amazing things with this. So this is a SAGE direction center. Huge concrete blockhouses with 4-foot thick walls to protect against nuclear blasts. The computer rooms were enormous and actually filled an entire floor of the building. There were 2 computers. One was a backup and maintained the same information as the active one, so that if one went offline, broke down, there would be something to replace it. And you gotta understand that at the time of the earliest computers in the United States, downtime was typically 50%. 50% of the time they weren't working because they were made with vacuum tubes, which get very hot, and in a huge room full of hot vacuum tubes would break quite often. So this, you can't see this very well, but there's a guy down here looking at this screen, and what you're seeing up there is the northeastern United States and Cape Cod, which is part of Massachusetts. These screen rooms where they see the display of the SAGE system were called blue rooms because the light was always low so that they'd be able to visualize them. So I'm going to take a pause here and ask you for questions or comments, things that have occurred to you while I've been talking. Anything.
I didn't
Sure.
have an idea that they already had a satellite.
1957, Sputnik, the first satellite, didn't do very much. It was just like a silver ball that could reflect signals from it. But right after that, they started very quickly to develop more. I mean, the concept was older. The Soviets were just the first one to get it into space. There's a whole politics of satellites where the main purpose for the United States and for the Soviet Union was to spy on the other country. But the way they were sold to the public was that they were communications satellites. And they did that too, but that was the public purpose.
There
If I have to talk on the...
is a question from online, but go ahead if you want.
No.
They say, somebody asked, did this system ever prevent an ICMB attack or at least something similar? And then they said it never worked, right?
Right. No, it didn't work very well, and one of the famous moments was when they turned on one of these things and it seemed to show an incoming Soviet attack, and people freaked out until they realized that the radar signals could bounce off the rising moon, and then they would look like a Soviet attack. So there were many things they had to learn before the thing worked, and it never worked perfectly. And in one sense, the irony of the whole thing was it produced many false alerts. That's the main thing it did, was produce false alerts.
I'm not sure how you're going to develop, but what were the main technological innovation that they had to, or they wanted to develop in order to make the system work?
Well, there's a very long list. I mean, this was probably the single most important computer of the 1950s. One of the main things was magnetic core memory, which was the earliest form of solid state, non-vacuum tube memory, which is much more stable than vacuum tubes. And so the cores refer to small ceramic donuts, rings, that were wired together, and each one was a bit. So that language is still with us. And have any of you computer people ever heard someone talk about a core dump? I see some people nodding. I mean, that's what that was. It was like just spilled all the contents of memory. That's a core dump. So you're dumping the magnetic cores into printing them out. But I mean, there were many others. I mean, they made displays that could visualize these signals, and there was a light gun that you could use on the screen to draw a line between an incoming aircraft and an interceptor that you controlled, and that would make the interceptor go to that target. It was supposed to be eventually fully automatic, where once you drew that line, that interceptor would automatically fire on whatever it thought was the incoming target. It never really developed because, again, lots of errors, and it would have been insane to really turn it over to machines, but we're getting there. Anything else? Yeah.
Can you expand on anti-militarism? Anti-militarism.
Sure. Yeah. So, the Soviet Union maintained an enormous army. I mean, they had millions of men under arms after the end of World War II, and they stayed that way. And many societies have worked that way, authoritarian societies where they have a large military, that those are the people who end up being the generals, but then also becoming political leaders. And the United States, as a political system, tries to avoid that by having fewer people in the military, having it not be a cookie. And I should say tried, because after World War II that stopped. I take it back. The military draft in the United States did not begin until the Vietnam War. And that's when we began to go back to that very large standing army and compulsory military service, that sort of thing. But so for Truman and Eisenhower, the presidents in the early phase of the Cold War, it was much better to use technology and have more of that and fewer people. So that's all. It doesn't mean we're sort of against military force. The US is definitely not known for that. Okay. So this iconography, this computer control room with a display of the geography of some part of the world or the whole thing, you've seen this over and over and over again. It's been in many, many movies. It's a trope. It's a kind of a standard figure of film. They have this idea that computers can give you this mastery of an enormous space, and you just push a button and do something really bad to someone in that image. So this is the North Atlantic Air Defense Command in the 1980s. This is the Northern Command, which is part of that, in very recently. So you can see up there on the right-hand side, there's Japan off the coast of Asia, and the United States on the left. I'm not sure what the other two are, but they're monitoring the planet from their control room and doing stuff to people somewhere else. All right, I cannot possibly talk about the entire Cold War, so I'm going to just jump forward in time to what some people have called Cold War II. That began with Jimmy Carter and then Ronald Reagan placing nuclear missiles closer to the Soviet Union by putting them here in Europe. Very controversial at the time, led to massive protests, but it did happen. And Reagan had this idea that was sort of sold to him by Edward Teller, and he did a kind of Trump-like thing. He sort of went on TV and announced that we were going to do this before he had really checked to see whether it was technically possible. This was the Strategic Defense Initiative. And really, in a lot of ways, just a much updated version of SAGE, except that it was going to be so complicated and so potent against incoming nuclear missiles. Now, by this time, you have intercontinental missiles and also nuclear submarines with nuclear weapons on them. And those, if they get close enough to the US coast, can hit a target in 15 minutes from their location. And at the time, they were almost impossible to detect. So I'm happy to talk more about the technical aspects of it, but the main thing is this. So here's the speed coming back in. High tech leads to faster and faster, less and less delay, more need for permanent alert, always on, ready to respond at any time. How do you do that? And this system was going to be, the missiles lift off, and for about 1 minute, the heat signature of their exhaust can be detected by satellites. So you spot that, you aim at the missile, and you shoot it down. And the attack might consist of hundreds or thousands of missiles. And you'd have to hit all of them in that first minute during the boost phase, because once they go ballistic, the rocket stops emitting heat, the warhead flies, the warhead can't be seen, and the missiles can do things like release a whole bunch of aluminum chaff into the air as they go, which would confuse the radars even further. So they had these ideas for X-ray lasers in space that would be essentially huge arrays of laser rods, and then you explode a nuclear bomb beside them and focus that energy as laser beams on all the rising missiles. I mean, just even to contemplate it just seems insane. And yet they thought they could do it. So Reagan announced it. It was going to be a shield, an umbrella, a bubble, a dome, a container that would protect the whole continent. And a big piece of it was software, because all of this would have to be under computer control, and that piece of software that did all that controlling would have to work right the first time, because you're never going to test a system like that under truly realistic conditions. And they said amazing things. We might have the technology so the president couldn't make a mistake. And my favorite of all, we prevent bugs by design. We're just not going to have bugs in this software. We're just going to rule them out in advance. And anyone who has ever programmed a computer, I invite you to try that. Okay, so that happened, and it developed, and it actually is still going on. And a lot of these systems are pretty good now, but we are never going to defend against thousands of intercontinental missiles. Not happening. Billions were spent on it. This is from the early 1990s, and I know you can't read it from back there, but it shows they've spent about $8 billion, and about 10% of that money went to software. Jumping ahead again. So the Cold War comes to a close more or less in 1989, 90, 91, 92. And then there's a period of wars over oil. There's Persian Gulf War. There's a lot of other things that happen. But then a huge political event in the United States is the attack on the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001. And when they fly two terrorists take over airplanes, commercial jets, and they fly them into these two huge towers in New York City, and 3,000 people are killed, and it's a huge disaster and terrifying. I mean, I remember that, watching it myself on the day it happened. And that was Al-Qaeda that sponsored that. Later there was the Islamic State still going, lots of other Islamist movements, and we sort of get the same concept, but with some twists on it. And one is that we don't really know what the weapons are. It's not, all high tech anymore, because it can be somebody can make a backpack bomb and do something really awful with it. There's a sense that the border, the natural borders of the oceans are just not going to protect us anymore, and that there's as in the Cold War, a need for a kind of permanent alert. The ideologies become very salient. There's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, a lot of attacks on Muslims, and some Muslim terrorism that happens, nothing as dramatic as September 11th. And it leads to these two very, very long wars, Iraq and then Afghanistan, that went on for 20 years until 2021. So we're sort of back in that same space, and now we're trying to figure out what computers can do to solve that kind of problem. It gets much harder. So one spin-off of that, I'm going to come to agencies in a minute, but was this thing that was briefly called total information awareness. You know, we are going to see everything, the all-seeing eye of the computer. And I tell you, I have a sharp memory of an Air Force officer, general, talking to a conference I was part of in about 1998, saying, we are 2 years away from 24/7 real-time surveillance of every place on the planet. And I think we're still 2 years away from that, but we've gotten a lot closer, and that was the goal. So total information awareness, this became the Information Awareness Office. And the line up here says, Scientia est potentia, which means science is power, knowledge is power. And so they were just going to collect all kinds of information about everybody. And I mean, if you think about the world you live in now, that's where we are. That's what they're doing. And I just want to point out that the symbol here, which also freaked people out, was this kind of all-seeing eye up at the top of the pyramid there. That symbol appears on the dollar bill. It's on the back side. Okay, another pause. And then I'm going to start into AI.
You mentioned, according to the first Cold War, second Cold War, and
Yeah.
the 11th September, and present now, many times the word control. Could you conceptualize in the same meaning? The meaning varies through times.
Repeat the question.
So the question is, you know, I talked about control in a lot of different contexts over time, and how did the meaning change? That's a great question. Intellectually speaking, you know, this idea goes back to World War II cybernetics and the concept of mechanical control. So building systems that can do things by themselves that people can't do them more precisely than people. And then that feeds into the digital computer control system, which we've been talking about. And in the military, you get a whole series of acronyms there's C squared, command and control. There's C cubed I, command, control, communications and information. There's C4I, and I don't remember what that stands for, but just a whole series of them. But the word control is always in there. And one of my colleagues from Berkeley wrote a great paper once about command versus control that I always thought was really interesting. He had a military career himself, and what he meant was that on a battlefield, the traditional way of managing battle is that you have a hierarchy of command, and I just tell my sub-commander to take that hill, and I do not give detailed instructions. I just give a kind of meta-level instruction, and then it's that person's job to lead that fight in their own way, and down and down and down. So that's command, and what he studied some of these same things I'm about to talk about, and said the control view is not the right view for military systems because it implies that you have a complete grasp of the situation. The virtue of command is that the person who's doing the grunt work in the field sees everything that's actually there and not a representation of it on a screen. Others? Yeah.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with Yasha Levine's Surveillance Valley, but he kind of contextualizes JCR Licklider and what Licklider was doing in the 60s, basically promising the Pentagon the ability to understand communist insurgents over the network in the 1960s. And that's part of how he got funding for the ARPANET. And so the question is, this thing that's happening post 9/11, isn't it just the same thing that's been going on for 50, 60, 70 years? but the internet was built for the purpose that it's built for? Or was it actually different, do you think, in a significant way?
Let me start my next section here. That guy is going to figure here. All right, so AI has a complicated history, but I think you can kind of sketch it like this. The first way it was conceived was as a model of the physical brain. So there were neuroscientists at the time trying to figure out how brains work, and they began to try to build circuits, electrical circuits, that simulated what those neurons did. That didn't work out that well at the time. So then the next big wave was the idea of general intelligence and symbolic AI. We're going to use symbols and logic and math to describe the world and derive properties and actions that way. We get later a phase known as expert systems, which is basically everything is divided into facts and rules, and you get a long list of facts, and then you have a bunch of rules for combining facts, and you put those two things together in a very constrained domain, and you can get answers. Then, the world that we live in now comes back, which is brain modeling, except it's not really modeling a brain. It's using a simulated neuron that's much simpler than an actual physical neuron, and we can talk about that later. And there are really two big events in that history. One is machine learning, just finding the best statistical fit to a lot of big data, not an LLM. And then there's generative AI that everybody is talking about now, which can create images and text also out of big data. So just going back through this a little bit, in 1945, John von Neumann, designer of the designer of the ENIAC and then the much better EDVAC computer, he wrote this report about them, and he decided to use these words in describing what this machine did. So when he talked about logical elements, he called them neurons. When he talked about storage of information, he called it memory, which is a loaded word. We don't think of it that way anymore. It's just computer memory. But that's an analogy to our own memory, which is not much like computer memory. And then he wrote a book later called The Computer in the Brain, about the brain as a switching system. So this was a very popular way of doing AI in the 40s and 50s. The assumption at the time was that the brain self-organizes in response to stimuli. It's basically not programmed at all until you encounter things, and then it kind of develops its language and its object permanence and all those things. So, the phrase artificial intelligence came out of a grant proposal by that guy on the right, John McCarthy, who just kind of pulled it out of the air and promised a lot so that he could get a grant. Very effective. Marvin Minsky, in the middle, started his work in AI on brain modeling. He was making a mechanical turtle. Shannon, father of information theory, I'm not going to go into all this, but the key point here is this bit down here. Every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. So this is the argument for symbolic AI. People are going to design artificial languages that describe the world so perfectly that the machine will do exactly what we expect it to do in response. That's a tall order. There is a project called Cyc, C-Y-C, that began in the 1980s to make essentially a gigantic list of all the common sense knowledge in the world. And that project is still going today. It's selling products. But there's still more to do. Okay, here's our friend, JCR Licklider. I wish I had time to talk all about his history, but I don't. What I want to focus on is that this guy was a psychoacoustics expert who became fascinated with computers in the late 50s, and he was invited to lead this thing called the Information Processing Techniques Office at this agency, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, later called DARPA. This was essentially a slush fund of the Defense Department that could be used by its director to do anything that he thought was cool. So I interviewed John McCarthy once. He used to teach at Stanford, and asked him about this, his relationship with ARPA. McCarthy said, well, I decided I would move to Stanford, so I asked Licklider for a grant, and he wrote me a grant. There's no proposal, there's nothing but a conversation, and then, a few $1 million for a laboratory. So most of the rest of the government doesn't work like that. It's much more formalized. But ARPA could do anything. Licklider was famous for many reasons, but one of them was this paper, Man-Computer Symbiosis, that he wrote. And at the time, it's a very simple argument. It just says, computers can do some things really well, people can do other things really well, let's have them do the things they're best at, and not try to make the computer do everything a person can do, but find ways to make them work together, symbiotically. God, I never know where I am in the slides. So, DARPA made colossal contributions to AI research. I won't go through this whole slide, but this is the first wave here. This is the John McCarthy, Mark Levinsky, Shannon, all those people, symbolic AI. And now I want to talk about the next piece, which was the Strategic Computing Initiative of the 1980s. This is where I came into this story because I organized a conference about this program in 1985. And now that I say that, it might even have been 1983, but I think that's the year it began. So, strategic computing was the first DARPA program to take specific military projects as its end goal. McCarthy just gets money, go do something interesting, make an AI, make it play chess, whatever. This program said, we're going to build 3 things. First, a pilot's associate, so that a fighter pilot flying, zooming around, enduring forces of 5 or 6 gravitational equivalents, can talk to the airplane and tell it what to do. So, speech recognition and natural language processing. Pilot's associate. Next is naval battle management, where the computer, very much like SAGE, is going to have access to all the sensor information all around the whole battle group, not just the aircraft carrier, but other ships. Use its extensive knowledge base, that's expert systems language, to identify and alert the battle group commander to potential threat situations. And then the last piece was the autonomous land vehicle, ALV. This was going to be, able to navigate over unfamiliar terrain, going, 100 kilometers an hour, and potentially carry weapons. Image recognition and autonomous navigation. You see that, the way that thing looked there, sort of intimidating. The computer isn't even in the vehicle in this picture. The computer is bigger than that, and it's in a huge trailer, and it's sending signals to the ALV to guide it because the size was still so large. Okay, so we have those projects of the 80s. And there was a lot of resistance to those among computer scientists. Same with Star Wars, the bubble shield thing. The computer scientists would say, look, this isn't going to work. We know that you can't build software bug-free. We know it can't control a system like that with the speed that you need. And same thing with strategic computing. We don't want to do defense work. Toward the end of that program, these two books were published, Parallel Distributed Processing. They are about neural networks. And this is the beginning of the rise of the world that you live in now. So we essentially have this kind of stack here of symbolic AI, expert systems, natural language processing, machine learning, deep learning, many layers of neurons, and then generative AI. So what I want to leave you with, I'm going to show you a few more examples here, is that this is essentially an unbroken line of imagination, a technopolitical imagination that carries all the way through from the beginning of the Cold War to the present. Here's the ALV again. I moved here to France from San Francisco. It's full of these self-driving cars now. They drive around, we see them all the time. And there was a power outage the other day. That was a kind of a nightmare because they all just stopped, sat there until the power came back on. And in the Ukraine war, you may have seen this, they are now using robot tanks. They're not autonomous, but it's that same idea of the autonomous land vehicle, land drones, if you will. And they had tried robot dogs too, but they didn't work very well. They got stuck in the mud. Strategic Defense Initiative, 1983, 43 years ago. Today, Trump has this same plan, Golden Dome. Back to IPTO, man-computer symbiosis. This comes up over and over and over again, how that you can combine these two, machines with human-like cleverness, humans with machine-like precision. This is a recent book by an Israeli IDF officer, commander of an intelligence unit, who won a prize for his AI-based anti-terrorism system. Same concept. And if you took a look at any of the reading I sent out, this is one of the articles there. Israel is independent of the US. They have their own development, and they're very, very good at it. They did lots and lots of targeting in this war using an AI system that chooses the targets. And what that does is it means that instead of a person studying a target for an hour or so and then making a choice, the AI system says, here's a target. The officer looks at it for a few seconds or a minute, determines that it's a good target, and fires. The line about the machine did it coldly is an interesting piece of logic, and I don't, and I mean that, because what it's saying is that soldiers who have their own emotional stake in a war may make decisions about targets based on that, but the machine makes objective decisions. And one of the things I always say about AI is that, it makes mistakes, we all know that, but it makes different mistakes from the mistakes people make. And one of the things that happened in that conflict is that when they began, they were using I think the threshold was a 90% probability. So if they thought, according to the AI, that the target was 90% probable to be, a Hamas commander or something like that, that was good enough. You're going to hit that target, and the 10% might be collateral damage civilians. But then, to get more targets, they began to lower the threshold. 87%, 85%, because they got to keep hitting targets. And there's lots of IDF officers complaining about that. Last thing I'll talk about is this from the United States, Project Maven. So this began back in 2017, and Google was offered this contract. It's a military contract. At the time, intended to use AI to analyze drone images, again, to choose targets. But the Google employees resisted, and like 4,000 of them signed a letter, and Google backed out of that contract. So today, Maven is operating, not just in the US, but in NATO, in the National Health Service of the United Kingdom, and many other places. It's essentially an AI system for pattern matching. It looks at lots of different sources of data and tries to identify things that, in the case of the military, things that can be hit. In the case of, say, credit reporting, somebody who's got a problem, things like that. And what it's brought up is the fact that the Defense Department is moving toward using AI for many, many purposes. And what Anthropic, now that we're moving up to much more recently, Anthropic said, we will not do autonomous weapons. We will not do mass domestic surveillance. But OpenAI said, we will. And the big fear has been the idea that eventually a nuclear command might be turned over to AI. Now, so far, the last time I heard this directly from a military official was about 2 years ago. He said, there's no AI in the nuclear command system. It is all air-gapped, separated physically from the computer systems we use in nuclear command. But you can imagine the pressure to add it is enormous. So NATO is using it. Here's kind of what the display screen looks like. It picks out these targets and then shows you data about what they are, and you decide whether or not to hit them. And of course, we all saw these mistakes. This girls' school up here was hit, along with 3 other buildings in this compound. And a lot of people attributed that to AI, but it probably wasn't. It was old data. This is all a military compound, and it's likely that this thing was not an elementary school 15 years ago when that piece of data was put into the targeting system. On the other hand, the Army on the same day also hit a school in the first use of a new weapon, and that mistake has a lot more likelihood of being an AI-based error. T1K, that's what our insane war secretary, the kind of language he would use. It means 1,000 targets a day. Today, 1,000 targets. So a kind of factory-like pressure to produce. All right, I'm going to stop there. I could go on forever, and I thank you for enduring a very long talk. And I'm happy to take more questions and any comments at all. Thank you.
Prego, abbiamo ancora tempo per domande. Credo che se non c'è nessuno immediatamente, Isabella, prego. Vieni con il microfono. Sì. Usa il microfono.
Sorry.
Can I get the
yeah.
microphone?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so thank you very much for this talk and for what you have written in the past, because as Roberto was saying, also the close word was very important to me as well. I'm a historian of political thought, and in my discipline here in Italy, at least, technology and politics are still on two different universes. So to understand from you what you call technopolitical imaginary was very important to me. And it helped me very much also address a certain dissatisfaction with the general SDS approach, because what you say is not simply the social construction of technology, but also the technological construction of the social. So thank you again for this. I want to ask you a general question, let's say, that came to my mind while reading again the book in these last days. So, what drives history? So this is a huge question, of course, and I'm going to specify it a bit, because also in your talk here you said, okay, there was a problem within a Cold War scenario of command and control, of getting control of a whole huge, enormous situation through high tech. What about the real subjects, let's say? In this way, let's say, citizens, people are object of technological control. But in the decades that you describe, there have been a lot of social movements, anti-war movements, feminist one, movements for black power. What about them? Did they have any effect in causing, I know that cause is not a difficult word in this sense, some reaction also in terms of development of technology? Because if not, I had somehow the impression that it is also now when you say that this continuity arrives until today, I had the impression of a representation of history that leaves little space, basically, for some kind of intervention into what happens. And of course, I have in mind, so I don't know, the famous sentence by Marx that says we can write the history of invention since 1830 as a move within a class struggle. But also other readings, for example, of Beverly Silver in The Forces of Labor, that reads automation as a reaction to waves of labor unrest, and also war automation as a reaction, as a counter-revolution against anti-war movements, for example, that, of course, in the Vietnam War were particularly strong. And for example, but it is just an example to put the elements on the table, she considers Ronald Reagan strategic defense, I don't remember the name maybe, that you say it is the apotheosis of the cyber discourse. She reads it as a counter-revolution against something that is happening, so that given that people don't want anymore to enlist in the army, one need to find another way. So a different kind of anti-militarism as the one you were mentioning. So in the sense that there is the need to find new ways, given that people do not want to comply with this closed world rationality, let's say. So I wanted a little bit to ask you about this, because I think it is important. So it is important to also to discuss today. Because, for example, talking with my students here, so they are like very young, 20 years old students, mainly boys, because you know it's a polytechnic. So, and they somehow say we are never. It will not happen to us to go to war, because war is automated more and more. And I tell them, so I don't want to scare them, but I tell them it's okay. I would not be so sure at this moment, given what is happening. Not simply because war is everywhere now, but also because if we see at the war in Ukraine and Russia, there is also a very traditional element in there, together with the automation and artificial intelligence applied. So the number of victims of soldiers there is impressive. So it's incredible in terms of millions of people dying, actual people in the fronts. And so, what about this discourse of the potentiality of automating war as a political move in order somehow to give the impression that war is not so close to people as a threat, that will not, at least in the Western world, as it was in the Vietnam War, it was saying, okay, you're not going to, we're not making again the possibility that you die so much in war. So a little bit this, I wanted to ask you about this. And last point, in relation to this continuity, you say, okay, there are clear signs that there is a technological, a continuous technological movement, let's say, to improve the tools of command and control. Usually in book, when you read Ronald Reagan, it is at the beginning of the book and not at the end, as in your book. And it was very interesting to see it, because it is usually, in accounts of neoliberalism and the new phase of global capitalism, it usually starts with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, maybe Pinochet. So so what do you think has changed in the last decades? For example, okay, private and public collaborations are as old as capitalism in one sense, but now there is a different relationship between big tech and states. There is not anymore the capacity of the US to build a global hegemony, actually, as it was the case, of course, during the Cold War. So could you say something more about this, what has changed? So I know there are big questions, I'm sorry for that.
No, don't apologize. They're very good questions. Okay, stay up here because you might have to remind me what some of them are. So let's see, so first thing, about resistance. Yeah. It's true that in the Reagan period, in the first part of the Reagan period, there was an enormous movement against the spread of nuclear weapons into Europe, especially in the UK, and also in the United States, and that did, it had a big effect. It did. Lots of people were involved in it, and lots of people, and Reagan became worried that people would turn against him on the subject of nuclear war. So the SDI, the Star Wars idea, was partly about that. The thing that seems to have really changed the Cold War end was actually nuclear winter, not anything else, not the resistance movement. And so the idea of nuclear winter was developed between about 1981 and 85, and then became kind of common knowledge. It was discovered at the same time by American scientists and Soviet scientists, and they told Gorbachev, who's the leader then, about this. And when Reagan and Gorbachev met, that was a subject of their conversation. So that there was a moment when Reagan and Gorbachev met when they almost said, "Let's get rid of all the weapons," and then they didn't do it. But Gorbachev later said it was nuclear winter that made us go in that direction. So resistance today to AI, facial recognition, digital identity, border control, there's a great deal of that, and it's getting harder and harder to do, and it made me realize I have actually one more slide, which is this thing that just came out earlier this month about Palantir, which is the principal contractor for the Maven system. And this is a book their CEO wrote, and it was summarized, basically an AI summary of the book. And these are just some pieces of it, where they say, now it's on us, Silicon Valley, to take over the arms race, because the real arms race now is AI and not nuclear weapons. And they've been heavily criticized for this, but I think they're actually right about it. You know, if you're going to do an arms race, that's the arms race to do. And yet, I don't know what it's like here, but we see in the United States a huge resistance growing to the use of AI. I mean, it's coming partly from academics, but it's also young people. They learn about the mistakes that AI makes, and you know, they're fascinated with it for a while, and then they start to see that it really doesn't help them learn or think very well. And they're producing their own kind of mockery videos of AI. I never know what to think about stuff like this, because you know, the citizen movements are so easy to undermine, and so often they don't last very long, and the machine continues to do what it does. That's my depressed side. I wanted to mention that my wife Gabrielle Hecht is here in the audience over here, and she is the one responsible for that phrase techno-political in the techno-political imaginary. Where was I going with that? I've forgotten. Oh, and she forced me to read an article just before I came here that talks about a transformation in the military that, you know, is very, very real, which is that across the period I talked about, there was a long, long time when there was a kind of a defense industry, and it just did defense. So got very good at what it did, but didn't really, you know, its spin-offs were of questionable, and it was really focused only on those things. And especially in computing, as computing became more and more useful in the civilian world, firms took over all the R&D that the Defense Department had once done and did it much better, so that by the end of the Cold War, they were just buying parts off the shelf from firms. And the paper she wanted me to read talks about this as the emergence of military capitalism. And I think that's a good phrase for capturing something like this. I mean, this is a commercial firm. And take a look at what it's getting out of this. So the income that Palantir has made has gone up 670% in 2 years on the back of this development. Lots of other companies have cashed in on this too. So, I mean, Amazon Web services everything. Now the military is just one more client. And that's kind of the, you know, I think the emphasis of this military capitalism idea, that it's just become another kind of general industry that where what it does is only a slightly specialized piece of something that is done to all of us in, you know, as we pass through border control and interact with our own computers, search the web, all of that stuff. I don't think that's a very effective answer, but
No, it's fine.
it's something. What else?
Prego?
Nobody wants to fight me?
Any questions from the students?
I'm not sure if the microphone or...
Yeah, use the microphone, please.
That's enough. Thank you very much for it. Because I am an historian of science and technology, I'm more familiar with the historical pattern. In the last part, I wasn't sure, because when you wrote the book, of course there was a role for the computer that was also metaphorical and imaginary. In the last transformation, the present, in the Russia here, I mean, we can see the historical pattern and the impact to the military, but what about the metaphor? Is still the metaphor crucial there? In what sense? What is the impact of this metaphor and what's going on now? And the second point is it's a different, maybe related, but it's a different point of view. I'm a historian most interested in international exchange and cooperation in science and technology. And of course, that we're computing, all technologies and science has the strong role, which is now called, for many reasons, from different perspectives, science diplomacy. So it has a role in international cooperation, which is also political and diplomatic. So how do you feel the connection between the strongly military impact on specific technology, now focus on the computing, and the part that computing is still part of what needs to move somewhere, at least between partners, but not only between partners, because there were also medium for negotiations among also the US and the USSR, there were exchanges also in that respect. So how do you see the strongly military related developments of technology and their diplomatic uses, which is also for maintaining asymmetry, hegemonic, but is still in the terms of exchange and cooperation in the international arena? So these are the two questions. I'm sure it was clear. So the first is about the metaphor, how it's still relevant, or if it's still relevant today, and the second is about the international elements of this.
Thank you for that summary. Okay, so the metaphor, I mean, some of it's very clear. The neural network metaphor is just widely accepted. And I mean, you know, so I taught at Stanford for a long time, interacted with lots of computer science people, and today it's just taken as a literal fact that a computer neural network is equivalent to what's happening in here. And that always surprises me, because I would think that, you know, that there's a kind of scientific side of this that would reach them at some point. It's just not really true. I mean, you know, neurons are amazing things. They used to think that they worked like, you know, the kind of weighting system in a computer neural network, but now they believe that there are thousands of bits stored on the dendrites of each neuron, structures that were never seen as part of the information storage at all. They have error rates of like 10%. So how we can think clearly with error rates of 10% in our hardware is kind of mysterious. Though when I think about how clear my own thinking is, maybe that's not so hard to explain. But the metaphor is taken quite literally, and I mean, the number of people who have been completely convinced that, you know, Claude has consciousness. I mean, Richard Dawkins is in the news today, the last few days, because he's been convinced by that. You see this over and over again, that just let me tell one story. So I had a colleague at Stanford in the 80s, in the 90s, named Cliff Lynch, I think that's his last name. He's a sociologist, and this whole series of studies about computers and gender and race. And what he did is he simply set up a little Macintosh computer, put a label on it that said, "I am a female computer." And on another one, it would be, "I am a male computer." And then he kind of did classic assessment of how people responded to the machine. And people actually treated the female computer as a, you know, in a stereotypically gendered way, and the male computer vice versa. He found that it was trivially easy to get a computer to represent some social characteristic just by labeling it that way, or painting it pink or blue or something like that. So people are very susceptible to anthropomorphic ideas. And now we're in a phase where they do things that are really much more sophisticatedly like people, so it's easy to make that conversion. And yeah, all right, so much for the metaphor. The science diplomacy question, how do you connect that to what I've been talking about? What's the... in the first, say a little more about it.
My question is the following. So when computers became part also of the negotiation, but what can be transferred, what can be shared with, certainly with a lot, but not all, also in other part. There is a metaphor of control or command. I mean, about what the role of computer is. If you think that this metaphor is traveled outside of the US, what is the international perspective of how the computer is being imagined in the US when it traveled also for reasons which are more connected to international relations, to the political level? I mean, the SDI initiative, for example, of course, it connects to specific also negotiation. I mean, it is a military element which occurs also in connection with agreement which had already been placed about anti-ballistic missiles. So it's going to, in a way, modify the diplomatic agreement, and then the logic behind that, how did it travel to the Allied or also to the USSR? I mean, the logic behind that traveled in this international area.
Well, the USSR is a really interesting case. It's not the writing about it in English is not enormous, and it has been hard to do much research on it in the last 20 years, and even harder before that. But a few people have tried, and one of the ways that they did in the early days, they did a lot of copying of American machines, reverse engineering IBM equipment and making it their own. But they developed a computer industry of their own. And the social aspect of it was fascinating because at least the arguments I've read by my colleagues, I don't know this from my own knowledge, but what they say about it is that the big goal that the Soviets had was central planning for their economy. And they had a whole system for trying to do that with computers, and it seems like a good idea. But in the end, the incentives for all the people providing data to the central system were to oversell their own capabilities so that they would be rewarded, and it messed up everything they tried to do with the computer system. And the same thing when they tried to build a network. The Soviet Union was full of perverse incentives for people to, the classic Soviet joke was, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. So, we're not, a lot of what was happening was just a front. Science, diplomacy, peace. It's not a language I speak. We'll talk about it more later.
Ok, allora c'è il professor Mattozzi, poi c'è una domanda da remoto. Intanto se qualcun altro vuole fare domande me lo dica, perché abbiamo ancora una ventina di minuti. Okay? Prego.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk, and I want to connect to two different points of your talk. So the first one is earlier in your talk. It was about Licklider, ARPA, and MEC. I don't remember the name. McCarthy. Yeah. And it is about the architecture of fundings, because you said that McCarthy was actually working in Stanford. So DARPA would not do research on his own, would fund universities to do research. Right. Is that right? Can you expand? So this is the first question. The second question, it's not a question, it's more a comment, is about Star Wars, SDI, Global Dome, and your connection with Israel. And of course, there is also there a connection because we know that Israel has this Iron Dome, which is actually working quite well. I don't know. So clearly, this US-Israel connection, I guess, is very important, also in terms of imaginary.
Yeah.
So these are 2 points.
Sure. Okay, so we'll take in the last one first. So yeah, Iron Dome, the Patriot, missile defense system, those do work well. But the thing is that they're much more local. And the things that they are trying to hit are moving at a much lower speed than an intercontinental missile, which arrives at 11,000 miles an hour, 20,000 kilometers an hour. So much harder to hit. Let's see. What the first question was about Licklider and funding.
The architecture of funding.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. I spent a lot of time on it in the book. So after World War II, there are kind of 2 streams. There is classified military funding, where you're not allowed to discuss the work. And then there is open funding from an agency like DARPA or the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health. And the way the funding system developed in the US was that universities housed most of the research work and then are paid by the federal government to do part of, the federal government pays part of the cost of that person, that lab, doing the work. The university pays the other part. So the professors teach, that part is paid by the university. The research part is paid by the federal government. This has come back to bite us in a huge way now under Trump, because what he's been able to do by, he's essentially writing off whole sections of the National Science Foundation. And that means that not only will not all that research not get done, but the funding it provided to the university for its basic operations is going away. So he's able to gut the university system, and especially the elite universities, at the same time as he gets rid of science he doesn't like climate science. There was a change. So the DARPA situation is very unusual because it did not require all the kind of formal review that almost everything else does. And after the Vietnam War, there was a change in the way that the military could fund things. They were no longer permitted. A lot of universities signed off on classified research even before that, but then they were prevented from taking classified military funding. So at that point, they put some of their money into private labs and industry labs instead. But yeah, there's a whole deep tie between American universities and military funding, federal funding in general.
I have a question by Professor Giovanni Reghis, from remotely connected. Do you see any continuity between the Total Information Awareness Project and what the US government is doing now thanks to Palantir, namely the total control of the citizen's mind, given that to control the brains of your own citizens is as important as to control the moves of the external enemy?
Well, I don't know if I would go all the way to where the questioner has gone, but I think we're not that far away from that. And of course, one of the things that has happened just in the last 10 years is the takeover of all our media in the United States by this small handful of billionaires. And then some of them, like Elon Musk, and Peter Thiel, have deliberately used it to shape how people think about them, about AI, about government projects, about the government itself. They have been involved in our elections, and not in a way that is obvious to everyone. I mean, the stories around the 2016 election, the use of social media then to kind of move people's perspective right or left. You know, both of those things have been done. It's become a very powerful vehicle. Many people are unaware it's even happening, and they are changed by it. So yeah, I would say that is happening right now in the really complicated conflicts in the Middle East. That is an information war, and we are all getting messages from Hamas and from Iran and from Israel and from the United States and from the billionaires. All of them are actively trying to shape how we view these things by putting out or amplifying, you know, can be factual news, but just pushing it, putting a spin on it, all of that. None of that is entirely new, but the scale of it and the ability to do it so quickly and easily is big. And then, of course, you know, there's Russia, and they too continue to bombard us with disinformation, and misinformation shape how we think.
Bene, ultima domanda o commento, poi lo lasciamo riposare il nostro ospite. Ok, vi ringrazio anche chi è connesso online, grazie molto.
Thank you so much. This is kind of a messy talk, and I really appreciate you being here to let me mess around.
Grazie anche a tutti quelli che hanno contribuito alla conversazione e a chi ha organizzato. Valeria è dovuta andare via. Grazie molto anche a Valeria.